Make my son speak. I'll buy you this restaurant, said the billionaire. Then the waitress. What if one kind moment could help a heart that has been silent for 3 years? The morning rain tapped against the windows of Maple Street Diner when James Whitmore walked through the door. His 8-year-old son, Daniel, held his hand tightly. The boy hadn't spoken one word since the accident that killed his mother, and James had tried everything. Doctors, therapists, even moving across the country, hoping a new start might bring back his son's voice. But Daniel stayed locked in his silent world. Those big brown eyes held secrets too heavy for someone so young. The diner was busy with people eating breakfast, but Helen Carter noticed them right away. Maybe it was the way the well-dressed man's shoulders looked tired, or how the little boy held his father's hand like it was his only safety in a storm. She'd been working as a waitress here for 12 years, and something about these two pulled at her heart in a way she couldn't explain. "Where are you watching from today?" Helen walked to their corner booth with a warm smile, the kind that had made many customers feel at home over the years. James looked up with tired eyes that showed he hadn't slept well in a long time. "Good morning," she said gently, placing 2 menus on the scratched table. "I'm Helen. What can I get you today?" "Coffee black," James replied, his voice showing he was a man who'd been fighting a hard battle for too long. He looked at Daniel, who sat perfectly still, staring out the rainy window. "And chocolate milk for him, if you have it." Daniel's silence filled the space between them like a heavy blanket. Helen had raised 3 children of her own and worked in this family diner long enough to know when something wasn't right, but she also knew when not to push. "Coming right up," she said, her eyes meeting James's with an understanding that didn't need words. As she poured the coffee, Helen heard pieces of James's quiet phone call. "No, Dr. Peterson. He still hasn't said anything. I know you said it takes time, but it's been 3 years. Yes, I'll keep the appointment next week." His frustration was clear, and when he hung up, she saw him run his hands through his graying hair like a man at the end of his rope. When Helen came back with their drinks, she noticed Daniel's eyes had moved to the small fishbowl on the counter, where Goldie, the diner's old goldfish, swam in slow circles. There was something in the boy's face, not quite interest, but the smallest flicker of attention she'd seen since they arrived. She set the chocolate milk down carefully, making sure the glass caught the light just right. "That's Goldie," Helen said softly, following Daniel's look. "She's been swimming around that bowl for almost as long as I've worked here. Sometimes I think she's got stories to tell, but she keeps them all to herself." James looked up quickly, something changing in his face as he watched his son's tiny nod. For the first time in months, James felt a small spark of something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. But as quickly as it came, reality crashed back. Daniel had shown interest in things before, only to go deeper into his silence when anyone tried to reach him. Over the next 2 weeks, James and Daniel became regular customers at Maple Street Diner. James had made his business trip longer, desperate to hold on to anything that might bring his son back to the world of the living. Each morning they'd sit in the same corner booth, and Helen would bring Daniel his chocolate milk while sharing quiet thoughts about Goldie, or the weather, or the way the morning light made patterns on the wall. Helen learned pieces of their story in gentle bits. James was a successful tech businessman who'd built his company from nothing, but all his money and connections couldn't fix what mattered most. Daniel had been in the car when his mother, Catherine, died in the accident. The boy had spoken normally before that day. "A chatterbox," James said with a broken smile. But something had changed deep inside him when the world turned upside down in those terrible moments on a rainy highway. "The doctors call it selective mutism brought on by trauma," James explained one morning while Daniel colored on the paper placemats Helen had started bringing him. "He can speak physically, but something's blocking him emotionally. It's like he's protecting himself by staying quiet, but he's disappearing a little more each day." Helen watched Daniel carefully color inside the lines of a drawing of a house, his small fingers holding the crayon with strong focus. She'd seen this kind of careful control before, in her own daughter after her father left, in herself during the hardest years of being a single mother. Sometimes holding everything together on the outside was the only way to keep from falling apart completely. One morning when James stepped outside to take an important business call, Helen made a decision that surprised even her. She sat down across from Daniel, something she'd never done before. "You know," she said quietly, "Goldie told me a secret yesterday. She said she gets lonely sometimes, swimming in circles all by herself. She wishes someone would visit her and maybe tell her about the world outside this fishbowl." Daniel's crayon stopped mid-stroke. His eyes looked toward the fishbowl, then back to his drawing, then up to Helen's face for just a moment. It was the first direct eye contact he'd made with anyone other than his father in 3 years. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. When James came back from his call, he found them sitting in comfortable silence, Daniel still coloring, but somehow less stiff than before. There was something different in the air. A small shift that made James's chest feel tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when the diner was unusually quiet. Helen was refilling Daniel's chocolate milk when she noticed tears sliding silently down his cheeks. James was in the restroom, and for the first time, Daniel was alone with her. Without thinking, Helen slid into the booth beside him, her motherly instincts taking over every professional boundary she'd ever kept. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling a clean napkin from the holder. She didn't try to touch him, but her presence felt like a warm hug. Sometimes the sadness just needs to come out, doesn't it? Daniel's shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Helen felt her own eyes burning with tears she hadn't cried yet. She'd lost her husband 5 years ago, not to death, but because he couldn't handle raising their special needs daughter. The abandonment had left scars that still hurt on quiet mornings like this one. "You know," Helen said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had a little boy once who stopped talking too. Not because of an accident, but because his daddy left, and he thought maybe if he was very, very quiet, daddy might come back. He was scared that if he said the wrong thing, everyone he loved might disappear." Daniel's crying slowed, and he turned to look at her with those impossibly deep brown eyes. In them, Helen saw understanding that cut straight to her soul, the look of one wounded heart seeing another. "That little boy was my nephew," she continued, the lie coming easily because the emotional truth underneath it was so raw and real. "And one day he realized that the people who truly love us don't leave because of the words we say or don't say. They stay because love isn't about being perfect. It's about being there." When James came back from the restroom, he found Helen and Daniel sitting together in a way that looked both natural and amazing. Daniel wasn't speaking, but something big had changed. The wall of sadness that had surrounded the boy seemed thinner somehow, as if Helen's words had created tiny cracks where light could come through. "Mr. Whitmore," Helen said as James came near, "could I speak with you privately for a moment? Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." As they stepped away from the table, Helen's words hit James like a shock. "I think Daniel's not just protecting himself from more loss. I think he's protecting you from hearing how much he hurts. Sometimes children carry silence like a gift, thinking it will keep the people they love from breaking too." The next morning changed everything. James and Daniel arrived to find the diner unusually empty because of a broken water pipe on the next block. Helen was the only one working, moving between tables with practiced skill. As she walked to their booth with Daniel's chocolate milk, a loud crash of thunder shook the building, and the lights flickered. Daniel's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. His face went pale, his breathing became fast and shallow, and he began to shake uncontrollably. James reached for him, but the boy pulled away, lost in the grip of a memory that had haunted him for 3 years. The thunder, the sudden darkness. It was too much like that terrible day when everything changed. Helen didn't wait. She knelt beside the booth and began to speak in a calm, steady voice that cut through Daniel's panic like a lighthouse beam through fog. "Daniel, honey, listen to my voice. You're safe. You're here with your daddy in our warm, dry diner. The storm is outside, but we're inside where it's safe." I can't lose him too," Daniel whispered so quietly that Helen almost missed it. The first words he'd spoken in 3 years came out broken and scared, but they shattered the silence that had held him prisoner. James froze, tears streaming down his face as he heard his son's voice for the first time since Catherine's funeral. But Helen kept talking, her voice steady and sure. "You're not going to lose your daddy, sweetheart. Look at him. Really look at him. He's right here, and he's not going anywhere." Daniel's eyes found his father's face, and something inside him finally broke open. "Daddy, I was so scared. I thought if I talked about Mommy, if I said how much it hurt, you might go away too. I thought maybe if I was really, really quiet, nothing else bad would happen." James slid into the booth and pulled his son into his arms, both of them crying now, years of held-back sadness and love pouring out in a flood of healing words. "Oh, Danny," James sobbed into his son's hair, "I could never leave you. Never. We're going to be okay, buddy. We're going to be okay." Helen stepped back, giving them space while her own tears fell freely. She'd witnessed something special. The moment when love finally found its voice again. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As the storm passed and the morning sun broke through the clouds, James looked up at Helen with gratitude too deep for words. "You gave me back my son's voice," he said simply. "Name your price." 3 months later, Helen stood in the freshly renovated dining room of what was now Helen's kitchen, reading the inscription James had put on the wall, "Where silence finds its voice and hearts discover home." The brass plaque caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that had been cleaned until they sparkled like diamonds. True to his word, James had bought the diner and given it to Helen, but not before insisting on a complete renovation that honored the soul of the place while making it shine like new. The old fishbowl stayed on the counter, now next to a beautiful aquarium where Goldie swam among colorful plants and friendly companions, a gift from Daniel, who'd insisted that nobody should have to be alone anymore. Daniel, now a chatty 8-year-old who rarely stopped talking long enough to catch his breath, burst through the kitchen doors carrying a fresh batch of his famous chocolate chip cookies. He'd discovered a love for baking during the weeks when the diner was being renovated, and Helen had taught him her grandmother's secret recipe. "Miss Helen," he called out, his voice clear and bright as church bells. "Dad says the food critic from the city paper is coming next week." Helen laughed, the sound rich and warm as honey. "Well, then we'd better make sure we have plenty of your cookies ready. That critic won't know what hit them." James came out from the kitchen where he'd been helping prepare for the dinner rush, flour dusting his expensive button-down shirt. His software company practically ran itself these days, allowing him to spend his time on things that actually mattered, like learning to make Helen's famous apple pie and watching his son bloom into the happy child he'd always been meant to be. "You know," James said, wrapping an arm around Helen's shoulders in the comfortable way of family, "I used to think success was measured in dollars and market share. Turns out it's measured in moments like these." Helen nodded, watching Daniel carefully arrange cookies on a display plate, his tongue poking out in concentration the same way it had when he colored those placemats months ago. Some evenings when the diner was quiet and the three of them sat together sharing stories and planning tomorrow's specials, she could hardly believe this was her life now. The bell above the door rang as the first dinner customers arrived, and Daniel ran to greet them with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd learned that words were gifts meant to be shared. Helen tied her apron and smoothed her hair, but before she stepped forward to welcome their guests, James caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing what we needed before we even knew ourselves." As Helen moved toward their customers with that warm smile that had saved one broken family and created another, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most ordinary moments hold the most extraordinary magic. Love, she'd learned, doesn't always announce itself with big gestures. Sometimes it whispers itself back to life, one chocolate milk and one patient word at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of healing and hope.